Immediately. Thank you for that reminder. So,
Hi.
hi, Sarah.
Oh, sorry. I thought I had you on mute. Sorry.
That's all right, Sarah. Good to have you on. So, over the last 3 weeks, this is our third session in this series. We have been looking at the books in the Catholic Bible that are not present in the 66 books of, if it is a King James Version. And we refer to these as a Deutero Canonical. And by the end of the series, each of us would be and should be comfortable with the term Deutero Canonical. And it simply means these books were added to the canon at a, if you want to say later, but not outside of the first, second century. So it is a part of scripture. These seven books we referred to have been a part of scripture from the very earliest times of the early church. And in the context of it being a part of the Greek version of the Old Testament, again, the term Septuagint is a term that you should now be familiar with. This is the Old Testament that was translated into Greek about 200 years before Jesus is coming. And that was the Old Testament used by a large population of Jews at the time of Jesus outside the diaspora in all the different regions where Jews existed. And there is clear evidence that these books were also used within Jerusalem and the early Christian church. So when we have early church writers, both the gospel writers, Paul himself writing a number of his letters in Greek, there is clear allusions to these books in sacred scriptures. So these books have always been in the Bible. The next term you should now be familiar with is a Latin Vulgate. And for the significance of the Latin Vulgate is that the earlier, not the earliest, the earlier translation of the Bible into Latin. And we remember that sections of the Old Testament, New Testament were written in Hebrew, the language, Aramaic, and Paul and many writers in Greek. So this fourth century was a translation of those texts into Latin, which would now become the universal language. Nothing surprising. English has been a universal language for some time now. So it's the same pattern that we see at that time. And when that translation was done and that edition of the Vulgate was produced by St. Jerome, he also included these books. So, making the statement that these seven books have never been added at any time in history. They've always been a part of biblical texts from ever since. Highlighted in the first session, which is something I want everybody to be very familiar with. The original King James version, when translated, also contained these books in them. So, if one is to refer to the King James Version, which continued after the 1800s, there is a clear statement of the books being removed. And then we're ending up with the 66 and not 73 as the Catholic Church. Second point that we learned, the Catholic Church is not the only Christian that uses, the Orthodox churches also uses these books. The non-Catholics refer to these seven books as the Apocrypha. The word means hidden, and we don't refer to them as Apocrypha, we refer to them as Deuterocanonical. In contrast to the other books, which are referred to as a proto-canonical, which means the first set of books accepted into the canon. Again, I want to make the
No, well,
parallel.
just one thing there.
Yes, sir, Leslie.
That was 1827, right?
That is 1827, and then finally in 1855.
What happened? Oh,
So
so
in
what happened between
1827, sir Leslie,
1827 and
remind me what
55?
happened. Remind me what you learned last, Week before last, that happened at 1827.
You know, so them have some word for meeting and
All right, so it's called the
mm.
Apocrypha controversy.
Oh
So
yes.
the Bible Societies was confronted by a number of groups of churches in England, and the Bible Society had the responsibility, took on the responsibility of publishing the Bible in languages, English, of course, and the various languages. And they were distributing the Bible with the Apocrypha because it was the King James they were doing. And the Puritans and the Calvinists in England at the time actually made great objections to these books being included in the Bible. And that's the turning point after 200 years of the books being in the Bible when they were removed. So it's called the Apocrypha controversy. 1827, and that's when the Bible Societies decided that they'd no longer include the seven books, the books they refer to as the Apocrypha, and printed Bibles, go distributing. And of course, the significance for us, let's say, in the Caribbean or in Jamaica, uniquely in the Jamaican situation, which is going to come into next week's presentation. The Bible that arrived in our island came in with the Spanish, which would have been the Catholic Bibles, which came in the 1494, 1505, with those first groups of um, priests who brought in the Bible. So the Catholic Bible was here. And then history tells us 1655, the British overthrew the Spanish from the island. And then from 1655 is when we'd have the King James Bible arriving. And our notation tells us that both Bibles were physically here. Um, uh, Technically, the Catholic Bible technically was banned in that period, technically, until about 1793. Don't quote me on the date, about the 1700s, where it was lifted after that. But the King James that was available had these books in them. So then, for the next 200 years, the King James Bible was distributed in Jamaica. Our Anglican brethren were using and would have been using King James Bibles with these books in there. They also use them in a very parallel fashion to how we have these books used in our liturgical readings, because the Anglican churches, coming up to 1 second, Lincoln. So they also had them in their liturgical readings. So not simply was it read as an individual, private in their own Bibles, but liturgically, as we too have them, they are also included in the Anglican. So in Jamaica, during that next 200 years, these books were being used until about 1855. That's when the books were officially removed, and then the King James Bible was then promulgated singularly without the seven books in them. Yes, sir, Lincoln.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what happened to the Maccabee Bibles at that time.
So I will ask you to hold that question until next week, because there are three answers to the question that you just raised. So everybody, next week we're going to be discussing the question of the Maccabee Bible, and that will answer Sir Lincoln's question as to, in the Jamaican context, we hear of this term, the Maccabee Bible, and what happened to it during the period of slavery, etc., etc., etc. So, since tonight I plan to focus a little more on the two books of the Maccabees, and the objective is to give us a bit of an insight for those who have never read, looked on, or touched them in our Bibles, to give you an oversight as to what they contain, what's their relevance. And then next week, we'll have this conversation raised by Sir Lincoln as to, when we talk about Maccabees in the Jamaican context, what exactly or what possibly is being referred to. So that is going to be more a sociocultural, historical, religious discussion. and in contrast. But I wanted to raise your awareness of what's in the book of Maccabees. And I hope by the end of tonight's session, any person who has had any kind of sense of why should we even have the book of Maccabees will move from that to going, okay, I now understand. It is in the Bible. It's always been in the Bible. And here it's its significance and what's its place. So I picked that up in detail next week, Uncle Lincoln. To remind us, those who weren't here last week, and my apologies, the session was recorded. I just noted that I hadn't posted it out. And all of these sessions are going to be posted on a YouTube channel with these videos that anybody can access them to catch up on any of the sessions that you have not seen. For those of us who have been here for the longer haul, the website will have the Bible study sessions that we've done in June and in May. So the topics we did in May, teaching on Pentecost, the teaching on the Trinity, Corpus Christi, all of those videos are posted on the website so that if anybody has a keen interest in the teachings that applied to the Trinity, the Sacred Heart, and redemptive suffering, those videos have been posted on it. So the books of the Maccabees. So we did the other 5 books last week. We looked on Wisdom, Sirach, Judith, Tobit, a bit of an overview on those last week. The 5 sections, that's going to be posted. And then tonight we're going to look on the other 2. So it's 7 books we're looking on. And there are additions to the book of Daniel, the book of Esther. And I think there's one correction I need to make, and maybe later on I'll bring it back up. The notes has one correction that needs to be made from the book of Tobit. And I quoted from the scripture prayer from the book of Tobit in chapter 7, and it should have been in chapter 13. So that I have corrected on the notes, but I had listed that last week erroneously. And thanks to Michelle for pointing it out to me. I'm quite appreciative when people actually check the notes and look to see if there are typos in there. So I'll just make that correction. So for tonight's session, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And as said before, this is the last 2 of the 7 books that we refer to as the Deutero Canonicals. And what's the significance? I'm going to put up my slide in a few seconds. I also want to make a little bit of a background comment on, because many times persons, when they find out that there's a certain percentage of these books that actually describe a lot of guerrilla warfare, and I'll explain that in a few seconds, ask why is it that, this kind of war that is going on, similar to the one going on over the same region over there. Now, why is it in the Bible? What's the significance as to why? And I have to take 2 steps back just to say, if you want a context of the type of writing that exists in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, it's actually very parallel to the writings that we find in the book of Judges. And in the book of Judges, I point out, this is the book that has the judges, great judges like Samson, Gideon, Ehud, Deborah, Jael. In the book of Judges, it speaks about God having promised the land, Joshua, successor to Moses, leading the people of the descendants of these, into the promised land. And going into the promised land, they're already the Moabites, the Hittites, the names that we keep hearing, the Philistines, already in the land. And they pretty much have to go in and take the land. So the book of Joshua and the book of Judges also has a fair amount of describing warfare between the Israelites and the surrounding peoples in trying to acquire the land. So, what I want to highlight, which is much more important, is there is a biblical theme that runs throughout the book of Judges, and the books of the Maccabees carry the same theme. And the theme is in the book of Judges that the people of Israel have come into the land and they are worshiping God and in right relationship with God. Over time, they fall out of relationship with God by their own sins. And that, of course, is a story of our lives. That when we fall into sin, we move away from God. And then, true to form, they are then attacked by all these other nations as a punishment. Then they call out to God, and God responds because he's going to be faithful to his covenant, even if the people of Israel are not, especially now. And God sends and raises up a judge. So the one we're most familiar is either Gideon or Samson. Samson does battle on behalf of his people, overcomes the Philistines, and the people return to right relationship with God. This is going to be referred to as the sin cycle, because after another time period, the very same thing is going to happen, and they are in good relationship with God. 40 years later, again, they fall off going after the gods of the other nations. And then God calls up another judge who will again fight on their behalf, Ehud or Gideon. And it's a cycle that continues. It's a cycle of the journey of faith, that we start out and we can be in very good relationship with God. It can begin from Sunday morning when we leave church, and sometime after we're challenged with the daily experiences that we have, and before long we realize that we're slipping, and we call ourselves and bring ourselves back around and says, Lord, bring me back around. Sorry for what I've done. And we know God is there. So it's a journey of faith shown through the sin cycle in the book of Judges. Similarly, we are going to find in the books of Maccabees a very similar theme worked out, and a key significant point of the books of Maccabees and the time period. The books are historical books with theological reflection, just like the other books in the Bible. And they describe a period about 175 down to 64 years before Jesus, before the arrivals of the Romans in Jerusalem, and before the time of Jesus. This is historical writings for the Jews, even though the books of Maccabees are not in the Jewish Bible. And there are at least a number of ironies here. So they recognize the historical events, but they don't have them in their scriptures. This is the only time in their history since King David and then King Solomon that they, Israelites, the Jews now, are in charge and governing the territory. This is the only time period. So after we have the period of King Solomon, the divided kingdom occurs in the Old Testament in the book of Kings. We then hear about the Assyrians attacking them, then the Babylonians coming down to the Persians, the Medes, then this time period with the Greeks. Throughout all of that time period, they've been under colonial rule. During the period of the Maccabees is the only other time period that they are liberated and govern themselves. And that's until the arrival of the Romans, who are then again take over and colonialize them, for want of a better expression. So this writing is historical to the Jews.
But the
They accepted.
Maccabees saved the Jews.
They did. So they literally saved the Jewish faith and the Jewish community from being simply integrated into the rest of the Greek culture and the Greek world. So literally, they did save them. And it's a historical. So it's accepted as historical writings. And for the Christian, it presents for us clear belief in the resurrection, and we have a mother and her sons who we'll look on in a few minutes, who, when challenged to give up their Jewish beliefs and their Jewish faith, they refused to and accepted death instead of either betraying their faith, as many would do. They prefer death. Quite appropriately so, this mother and her 7 sons, which I'll move to as a second thing, is actually alluded to in the letter to the Hebrews, where it speaks about women who go through persecution and look forward to the future of the resurrection. So the reference in the letter to the Hebrews is actually to this unnamed woman in the books of Maccabees, who we'll see in a few seconds. So the most important theological message is Maccabees 1, first Maccabees, is this group of guerrilla warfare trust in God, and they will be victorious, as we heard in the book of Judges with Joshua, because they faithfully follow the Torah and God's teachings. They refuse to give up on their faith. And their physical fight is exactly about saving the faith, and I'll explain that in a few seconds. So that's a theological reflection, that you remain faithful to God in times of persecution, and God will vindicate you. And that's the theological message to be taken from the first book of Maccabees. Now, the 2 books are not continuation, as we see in 1st and 2nd Kings, which describes an ongoing time period, or 1st and 2nd Samuel, which also describes an ongoing time period. They are parallels. So 2nd Maccabees retells events in 1st Maccabees and reflects and has another theological focus, which, so to speak, is coming from a different perspective. Now, most of us are not aware that this also occurs in the Old Testament with 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Both these parallel 1st and 2nds tell the stories of the great kings of the Old Testament and the prophets who come and guide them. And they're told from 2 different perspectives. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles will tell you about King David and King Solomon, and so too 1st and 2nd Kings, because it's a chronicles of the kings. But there are 2 tellings. And of course, we're familiar with this perspective. We have 4 Gospels. And the 4 Gospels are telling about the same life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, but looking from 4 different points of view, but the same person and the same reflection. So 2nd Maccabees highlights that same faithfulness to God, and further highlights that God will see us through, and if we are faithful, we will see him in the resurrection, which connects directly to the Christian time period. The Christian time period, Jesus is going to be teaching about the resurrection. Jesus is going to highlight, and we see that message clearly in the 2nd books of Maccabees, where people who are standing up for their faith, standing up for their beliefs, are going to lose their lives. And they refuse to take bribes, they refuse to give in knowing fully well that they're going to die. And they express the belief in not simply the resurrection of Israel as a community, and that is alluded to in the very famous dry bones in the book of Ezekiel. Dry bones, tell you about those. That Ezekiel passage was saying the people of Israel would be restored as a community under God. Maccabees is saying individuals who remain faithful will be seeing God in the resurrection. So that's one of the key themes. The second key point that the second book of Maccabees presents for us is, even as all of this is occurring, there are Jews who choose not to be faithful to God. There are Jews who will say, so what if we adjust to the Greek way of life? So what if we, and we'll hear the term come up, participate in their gymnasiums? So what if we just adapt to the Greek culture and not be faithful to our faith? And the tension here is between the Jews who say, absolutely not, you are being unfaithful to God, and the Jews who say, we can still be Jews and integrate into the Greek culture. And the tension is there because the war is going to be between the Maccabees and the Syrians, who are the army, and the Maccabees and the Jews, who are saying, I know nothing if we integrate. I know nothing if we just do what the rest of them are doing and give up our Jewish faith. So as Sir Leslie said, it is the Maccabees, because of their strident and guerrilla warfare, they battle against a large Syrian Greek army. And the name you're going to hear, and it should sound a little familiar, the general and the king was Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth. And this name should sound familiar. Antiochus, the city of Antioch, was named after him, or his family line. Don't be unfair. His family line, Antiochus, named that city of Antioch, carrying his family line. And Epiphanes should sound familiar because it does sound epiphany. His name alluded to the presence of God. So he literally believed in his kingdom that he was the presence of God. And that's a part of why his approach was now, all of the people in my kingdom should now accept our religion, our spiritual, all of what we are doing as Greeks. And that, please remember, the term is called Hellenization. If you remember Helen of Troy, parallels. So Hellenization was Greek culture being imposed on other people in the whole of the territory. And what was significant is, as you'd expect, Persians, Medes, the Midianites, all those other people, many of them didn't have a grave problem integrated, but the Jews did. And the single reason would be, we have but one God. So we can't accept any other perspective that tells us to accept any other gods or be unfaithful to this God. So that's the background to the second Maccabees. And it is in this context that we are seeing the historical development. So second Maccabees explains to us why we have the Sadducees, why we have the Pharisees, why do we have the Samaritans, and why do we have all of these different religious groups? Because out of this historical period, we're finding that each of these religious groups are established under the period and after the period of the Maccabees, and they then have different expectations of who the Messiah is. different practices as religious groups. The Pharisees believe in resurrection. The Sadducees don't. The Pharisees taught in synagogues. The Sadducees were in the temple. So this gives us the background to the New Testament and explains to us what's going on when Jesus arrives and why is it there's great tension between this group of religious leaders called the Sadducees, who don't believe in the resurrection, and the Pharisees, who believe in the resurrection and agree on Jesus, but seems to be turning out to be disagreeing with him on other matters of the law, which they are saying, hey, Jesus, you're breaking this law. Do you know we fought so hard for keeping these laws, so to speak? So that's a big background to the book of Maccabees and why it's relevant to the New Testament period. It's both historical for the Jews and it shows us the theological perspectives that we have coming into Jesus' time and Christianity thereafter with the early church. In the book of Maccabees, we see that Judas Maccabee prays for his soldiers who have fallen in war. He takes up a collection to give some tithes and prays for his fallen dead and prays for them that they will be brought into the resurrection. So, straightforward statement of fact. This is one of the major objections to the book by other groups who do not believe in praying for our faithful deceased. Now, please take this statement and hold on to it. This was a practice of the Jews as well, so it's not a unique practice to Catholicism. So, the Jews also have prayers for their deceases, even to today. So the Jews at the time of Jesus, which is what the Maccabees were, and the Jews today, the Orthodoxes also have prayers for their faithful departed. So it's not singularly the Catholic thing to pray for the faithful departed. And second point, the Orthodoxes also, of course, have these books in their Bibles as well. So that's, in a nutshell, some of the significant points. A fair percentage of the book describes the guerrilla warfare that this small group of religious believers are going to be constantly attacking this large army and overthrowing them, pushing them out of Jerusalem, and winning the battle to the point that the Greeks come and make a treaty with them, like how some world leader will have to make a treaty with somebody at some point in time, but makes a treaty with them, and then it is after this period that the Maccabees are going to be, quote-unquote, liberating the territory, and they control the temple again, and the first act that they perform is the rededication of the temple. So, 3 things that were done prior to this. The king at the time, Antiochus, puts out a decree because he's saying all religions must now come into one. You ever heard about one universal religion? That's what he attempted. And in doing so, he indicated the Israelites, the Jews at the time, and I promise to give that explanation tonight as well. The Jews at the time, actually, there were some who didn't have a problem with it, and the others who strongly rejected it. The second thing that they did was preventing the mothers. A law was put out that they could no longer circumcise their boy children, which was a sign of the covenant with God. So they're treading on some very serious ground here, that the Jewish mothers would be punished if they circumcised their boy children. And of course, under the quiet, they continue to do so. And then the really 2 other things that they did was he erected, we believe it's a statue of Zeus in the temple, on the temple altar, and the Jews were supposed to come and burn offerings to this in their own temple. And they also
Eat
did
pork.
some pork on the altar as well. So the altar was thoroughly desecrated because, as you know, the Jews reject pork in any shape or form. And so this was a direct attack on their religion. They were doing this as a Syrian leader was directly doing it because he wanted to break the spirit of the Jews so that they would conform. And of course, final thing, he told them that they couldn't read the law anymore. They couldn't read their Bibles and burnt some Bibles. And it is this that finally precipitates this group, this small family, says, this is the final straw, we will take no more. Now, the family name, which I hope you'll remember as well, is the Hasmoneans. So the family name was the Hasmoneans. A parallel example of that would be Herod, and you'll hear about the Herodians in the Bible, Herod's family line. So the line of this family was the Hasmoneans. However, the Judas Maccabee, Judas the Hasmonean, when he went to battle, was so physical that they called him the hammer. And the word, they believe the word in Hebrew translates to Maccabees. So the word Maccabees is not literally their last name. The last name is the Hasmoneans. And they then begin the battle to fight against the Greek army. They went out into the desert area and then would attack the army. The army came into Jerusalem, took hold of Jerusalem, and then they started. When the theological part comes in, the spiritual part comes in, is that Judas, his father Matthias, and all of the brothers commit to God that they would be faithful to God and they would not turn away from the teachings or the faith. And they believed that if they were faithful to God, then God would make them victorious in their battles. And that, of course, became true to form, that they became victorious, overcoming these large armies, taking back Jerusalem, and then the rededication of the temple to God, clearing out, taking out the old altar, burying it, and there's a point in there that they say they need to await a prophet to tell them what to do with the altar. That's a bit of a statement that comes on. So in the books of Maccabees, it speaks of the theme and the message, remain faithful to God. And in Second Maccabees, it shifts because in First Maccabees, the message is, we are faithful to God. Yeah, we lose some battles, but we will be victorious in the end. Judas is killed in battle and his brothers take over, and each of the successive brothers will die, and then one will actually then become ruler and king, and then continue the family name down throughout. So the message is not simply that we will be victorious and we won't die. It is we will possibly have to die. And that's where Second Maccabees picks up. Because in Second Maccabees, it now shows examples of individuals who were not the warriors, who were not fighting the battle, but they refused to give up their faith and were killed, martyred, and believed that they would be restored in the resurrection. So both messages are there. And I say that's because that's a balance that we have to acknowledge, that times that God is going to be there and carries out the plan that we think is God's plan for us and take us through and we're successful. And then there are times when the plan that we think it is won't work the way, but it doesn't mean God isn't on our side. It does mean you need to relook, rethink, and identify what then is God wanting us to do. And in this case, some were called on to give up their lives for the belief, knowing that God would be faithful to them in the resurrection. So we do have two more points I want to make. further to the Maccabees is also a stretch now from the time of the book starts about 175, and I'll say two more comments, and comes all the way down to about 64 BC. So that's pretty much 100 years. The overthrow is about 162, down to 62. We count downwards because it's BC. We're coming down from the larger number down to 0. Recorded in there is again human failing. And in here we find that successive groups of Jews, some are going to become traitors, some are going to be faithful. The Maccabean or the Hasmonean family also fall into these challenges. And one of the early challenges that they do, and it starts out as a right intention, but turns out as a wrong implementation. And that's a lesson that we have to carry through, that both our intentions and our execution must be right by God. We can't use a wrong intention to accomplish a right end or the converse. And in here, a number of times, the high priest position, people are going to be bribed to get the high priest position. This is after they've been liberated. And they take up the position of the high priest, but from dishonest means. And of course, you can understand the message is, if you do that, you're going to have a negative outcome. So a number of persons take up the high priest role, but through dishonest means. And of course, they come to a bad end. And that's the message of, if you do wrong, you're going to be punished for it. And that's a theme running through it. One of the Hasmonean brothers decides that when he becomes ruler, because his brother has been killed and he dies in battle, he is going to be king, and he also chooses to be high priest at the same time. Now, reason, so many dishonest people have been high priests. If I take it up, I know I'm going to be honest, and hence that takes us out of the problem of a dishonest high priest. Check the history, prophet, priests, and kings. The role of king and the role of priests have always been separated. So, right intention, but the roles have always been separated. And this lends itself to why we're going to hear one religious group being started, which is the Pharisees, now object to these leaders being both king and high priest. And they were correct, that they should not have taken unto themselves the position of high priest as well. And this is where the Pharisees break away, because they now say the high priest is corrupt and has been corrupt. And that's how the group called the Pharisees begin to separate themselves from the temple, because the Hasmoneans are the ones who are now controlling the temple, because they're the high priests. Not surprisingly, the Sadducees are the successors to the Hasmoneans. So at the time of Jesus, the people who are the Sadducees in the temple are the descendants of the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans. And the Pharisees have said the temple is corrupt. And in truth and in fact, they were correct, because a number of the high priests had been put into those positions. At the time of Jesus, we will see a parallel thing occurring, because we'll hear the temple and the high priest officials are colluding with the Romans, are colluding with the authorities, and are very, very close connected with them. The same thing. So the message is there that those who are in the leadership should remain faithful to what God has called them to their positions. End point on this, and then go to the slide, is this is the point in time when we're talking about the corrupt temple, is when the Romans come along in about 64 BC, when it's now the grandchildren of Judas Maccabees and the great-grandchildren of Judas Maccabees who are in charge. And the Romans come along and they pretty much are handed Jerusalem on a platter. They side, one of the groups in Jerusalem betrayed the Hasmoneans and invited the Romans in, and the Romans literally took over Jerusalem, literally without a great fight. They just marched in and took the city. And it's because one of the lines sided with the Romans against their own family members. So it's a warning to remain faithful. Just to remind you, about 300 years before the time of Jesus, we have Alexander the Great conquering the whole of that region. And that's where this whole description of the events actually start out, because Alexander the Great is the one who starts imposing the Greek language and the Greek culture on the whole of that region. And that explains why the standard language across the region was now Greek. Why many of the different religious groups, the Jewish religious groups, no longer spoke Hebrew, the ones in Egypt, Alexandria, and that's why they wanted a Greek version of the Old Testament. That's some of the conflicting discussions that come up. So let me just start with First Maccabees, just to give you the introduction so that you see it connects directly with the historical events. The First Maccabees chapter 1, the Jews in Jerusalem and in the land of Judea, and greetings to their brethren, the Jews in Egypt, and wish them true peace. May God bless you and remember his covenant with his faithful servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. May he give to all of you a heart to worship him and to do his will readily and generously. May he open your hearts to his law and his commandments and grant you peace. May he hear your prayers and be reconciled to you and never forsake you in time of adversity. Even now we are praying for you here. So the greeting starts out speaking to the people in the territory, raising for them this opening prayer for them. And we'll see this theme of being faithful to the covenant being extremely consistent throughout the books of the Maccabees. In First Maccabees, of course, and then later on in Second Maccabees, where, as I told you, it's not a part 1 and a part 2. It's a retelling of some of the events in Second Maccabees that have actually taken place as well in First Maccabees, and it's focusing on it from a different theological perspective. So that was Second Maccabees introduction, very spiritual approach, and the introduction from First Maccabees. Flip over quickly. And First Maccabees roots us after Alexander the Macedonian, and this is Alexander the Great, Philip's son, who came from the land of Kittim and defeated Darius, king of the Persians and Medes. He became king in his palace, having first ruled in Greece. He fought many campaigns, captured fortresses, and put kings to death. He advanced to the ends of the earth, gathering plundering from many nations. The earth fell silent before him, and his heart became proud and arrogant. And that's a signal biblically that he's going to have a downfall. He collected a very strong army and conquered provinces, nations, and rulers, and they became his tributaries. But after all this, he took to his bed, realizing that he was going to die. He therefore summoned his officers, the nobles who had been brought up with him from his youth, to divide his kingdom among them while he was still alive. Alexander had reigned 12 years. And it would surprise you that Alexander the Great conquered all of that region by his 31st, 32nd birthday. He didn't live past 33 years old. So he died in his 30s, early 30s, having conquered the whole of the known region. Notice the difference in tenor between the two introductions. Second Maccabees starts with a blessing and a greeting. First Maccabees starts with a historical notation, giving you the background of the history to what this event is placed. So the two books have two different approaches, two different theological sets of messages, both speaking to similar events that took place for the people. So his officers took over his kingdom, each in his own territory, and after his death they all put on royal crowns, and so did their sons after them for many years, causing much distress over the earth, clearly indicating that their rule was brutal, and of course the Israelites, the Jews at the time. So I want to take an aside to just clarify each time I say it, to make sure I clear, because it was a question that was asked. Is there a significant difference, and it's important to this text and the New Testament period, between the people being referred to as the Israelites or 12 tribes of Israel, the Judeans, the Jews, and are they all the same groups of people? And the answer is explained throughout the whole of the Old Testament and is appropriate so people appreciate why the terms are used. So we will hear the prayer of Judas. So we're in First Maccabees. It started with this prayer when his father dies, and it introduces the point that I want to make. So this is First Maccabees chapter 2, should have been 1, 2, verse 49 in chapter 2. And it's his prayer. When the time came for Matthias to die, that's the father who started this, he said to his sons, "Arrogance and scorn have now grown strong." And this is he's talking about the Greek armies. "It is a time of disaster and violent anger. Therefore, my sons, be zealous for the law and give your lives for the covenant of our fathers." Verse 51, "Remember the deeds that our fathers did in their times, and you shall win great glory and an everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful in trial, and it was reputed to him as uprightness?" If that sounds familiar to you, it should, because it comes up in the letter to the Hebrews about Abraham's faith being credited to him. And if you took the time, it's also in the book of Sirach, in Sirach 44-45, where they have a similar retelling. Then he speaks about Joseph, the one in Egypt, when in distress, meaning he was on many occasions treated, thrown into prison because of his not taking on his master's wife. When in distress, kept the covenant, and he became master of Egypt. Phinehas, our father, for his burning zeal. Phinehas was an Israelite priest who saw Jews being unfaithful to the covenant, and he got up and he slew them in zeal. And we'll hear somebody else in this book also do that. Receive the covenant of an everlasting priesthood. So we're at verse 55 in chapter 2 of First Maccabees. Joshua, for executing his commission, became a judge in Israel. Caleb, for bearing witness before the assembly, received an inheritance in the land. David, for his piety, received a heritage, a throne of everlasting royalty. Elijah, for his burning zeal for the law, was taken up to heaven. And we had that reading recently in our liturgical weekday readings. Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael. And those were the three for their faith were saved from the fire when they're thrown in the fire. The three young men. Daniel, for his innocence, was delivered from the jaws of lions. And so, considering this from generation to generation, that none who hope in him shall fail in strength. Do not fear the words of a sinful man, for his glory ends in corruption and worms. Today he is exalted, and tomorrow he is not to be found, because he has returned to his dust, and his schemes has perished. So children, be courageous and strong in keeping the law, for by it you shall be glorified. So that was the father's advice to the sons as he went away and they went into battle. Now, the 12 tribes are the 12 sons of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. They become the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes going to Egypt, they grow. And by the time we get to the kings of King Saul and King Solomon, they now become kings of Israel. The high point of the Old Testament. So King David, King Saul, King Solomon. They then have the decline after King Solomon, and it divides into two territories. And this is where now the next term is coming into play. After they divide, and the parallel to today's history is like North and South Korea. We have one Korea which has been separated for decades because of politics, and in the North you have one leader, in the South you have a separate leader. That's what became of Israel, the 12 tribes, after King Solomon. 10 of the 12 will be united in the North, and the other 2 will be Judah and Benjamin in the south. And this is where the name change begins to occur, because the Assyrians are going to take out the 10 tribes in the north. You'll find this in the book of Kings, and those people are scattered. And the Assyrians bring people from all around the territory and put them in the northern part of Israel. And these people intermarry with the Jews who are left, and they become Samaritans. That's why there's this tension between the Jews. In the south, we have Judah, and they are going to be taken off by the Babylonians. We are in Babylon, they come back, and it is after this point, when they return out of Babylon, the name shifts from being Israelites, because it's no longer 12 tribes, but significantly, the major tribes are now Judah and Benjamin. And hence, the place will be Judah, and the people will then be called Jews who then are going to be the groups of people. So when we get to this time period in the period of Maccabees, they are going to be interchangeably called the Jews and no longer be referred to as the 12 tribes of Israel, because 10 of the 12 are lost at this point in time and have not been recovered in this regard. When the time of Jesus comes, you hear about the Judeans, because the place is Judea, and the people are then going to be referred to as the Jews. This has now, of course, been the name that has been carried on till today in the history of the Jews. Maybe next week I'll pick up on the other part, because history again has deviated, because throughout the next 1,000 or 2,000 years, these people have been scattered throughout the territory. So even as we're explaining, when they returned from Babylon, some of them traveled from Babylon down to Egypt. And hence, there was a Jewish community living in Egypt from as early as the time of the Babylonian return. And that's a significant reason why when we get to this period, they will request that their Old Testament be translated into Greek, and because they no longer speak Hebrew. And this is close to the time of the books of the Maccabees. So that's a summary attempt of explaining the difference between Israelites being the 12 tribes of Israel, Israel, the place, the 10 tribes being taken away, leaving 2, and the 2 that remain will then be known as Jews and Judeans. That's the difference between the terms that are going to be heard. Throughout this book of Maccabees, you may hear them referred to as the Judeans when they're making reference to them. But just to make sure everybody's on the same page, if people are speaking about the place in Israel now, and if those people are Israelites and true Israelites, that's another discussion for a completely different tone. But just to say, coming up to this point. So that was a clarification I wanted to make. So throughout the books of Maccabees, there are a number of prayers. So let me get my slide just to make sure I stay on track and stay within time frame, because I think I've gone. And some of what I've, let me know that you're seeing the slide, and the bars will come down in 2 seconds or a few seconds. Okay. The bar is back up. So
No,
first, 1 second, let me just get my computer to cooperate with me so that I can put this out. So please do ask questions since it's 7:30.
there's no other question.
Please go ahead.
Okay, so the persons or the sect of people who survived Birkenau and Auschwitz and so on during World War II, who in 1949 were placed in
Yes.
a part of the world. How are they Jews? What makes them Jews? And which of the 3 phases of Judaism or Judaic history do they follow?
Right. So that question is very, very complicated for 3 reasons. The first reason is, notice, even as early as the time period we're talking about right now, Jews have been living outside of Jerusalem during this time period. So there's a large Jewish community in Egypt. There's a large community, we're going to hear about Syria. And when Paul starts to travel around his territory, he's finding Jews set up synagogues all around the region. So there have been waves of Jews traveling outside of Jerusalem. Just parallel to Jamaicans. You can find Jamaicans now in Sweden, Switzerland, Brazil. Jamaicans are just the same thing have happened. And different time periods over the next 1,000 years have Jews traveling throughout the region. And that we're going to see is over the next 1,000 years, when we now have the Muslims coming in, Jews are still traveling. And then after the 1000s going into the 1200s and 1300s, there are again waves of Jews who are moving out into Europe and into those territories. So just to summarize and saying, it is a very complicated question because majority of these Jews have now intermarried unless they were the strict Jews, the real Orthodox Jews, who did not intermarry with any other groups of people. So by time we get to the First World War, notice now we're in 1917, Jews are spread out throughout the whole of the region. And of course, they're coming from these Jews, but they have been intermarrying, which of course begs question about the true Jewish blood. And they've traveled in North Africa, East Africa, Europe. Just think of how Jamaicans are today. And we're just talking about that's just over, let's just say, 60, 70, 80 years of Jamaicans going out and traveling to Panama when the canal was being built. Jamaicans traveling to Cuba. It's a parallel scenario that Jews also were traveling for all kinds of different reasons. But as they have been traveling, they have, quote unquote, intermarried and intermixed with other people and other groups. And so to speak about pure Jews is a very problematic statement. And then the question you ask, we get to 1945 and this treaty that is put in place after World War II, where there is this agreement because of cooperation that they will now bring back the various groups of Jews that have been dispersed throughout Europe for decades and now repopulate the territory which was Palestine, now cut out a piece of that land and call it Israel. And that too has its complication because under World War I, that territory had some problems going on with who actually owned the land as it wasn't. So it is a very, very intricate, and there's a wonderful video done that I watched that I think is extremely helpful for persons who have this interest, because you're going to hear the different types of Jews, as Stuart mentioned a while ago. Each of these trace and claim they're tracing back to a particular lineage. It is, though, very, very problematic for people to speak of their lineage going all the way back to the Israel. And as you've seen, our Jewish brethren have traveled to the Caribbean as well and have set up families in the different territories. So that's part of the complication. Some of the ones who came here came from Lebanon and Portugal in the early days. So it's a very, very intricate question. And many of the discussions I hear people having are oversimplified and have not demonstrated a thorough, long study of this thing over, we're talking about practically the 2,000 years, and in this case, a little before, because they've been traveling to various regions. Does that help any much, Stuart? I will look for the video and share it with you, but there's one I found very, very helpful.
It's a pity with our time, but I think probably next time you could elaborate on the Ashkenaz and the Sephardic Jews who came here in Jamaica.
Right. And possibly what we do, we ask Jenny to see if she will get her husband and he can come and speak to us on in a more authoritative manner on that. But definitely, that's something we could look on later on. Any
Okay,
other
thanks.
questions now, everybody, since it's that 7:30 time? And I was just going to put up, just to summarize, so that everybody leaves with the awareness of the key themes in the book. So as I mentioned, 2 seconds on this, because I'm pretty much saying, as we heard the book starting out, faithfulness to God's covenant, those who sin by forsaking their God. Now, this is referring to the Jews, not the Greeks who are oppressing them. These are the Jews who say, oh, no, nothing. We can take on this Hellenistic culture. We can go to the Greek gymnasiums. We can cover up our circumcisions, because when you participate in a gymnasium, you participate full naked. So these are the Jews who are integrating and assimilating. First Maccabees is saying, you are going to be punished. And Jews must go to every length to protect God's law and strict adherence to the teachings. This, of course, and then second Maccabee, just to make sure. So these are the key points you should take from the session, is that there will be disasters. So it's not simply that we stood up faithful to God. It doesn't mean we won't encounter persecution. In their case, they actually conceded. God's purpose in permitting the persecution was to discipline the unfaithful Jews. The Jews when they were unfaithful. And this is seen in 2nd Maccabees, so that he may not take vengeance on us afterwards when our sins have reached their height. This is a kind of saying, do take your children in hand early and don't allow them to grow in bad ways. This is saying God uses method of purifying, purging out, and especially. But at the same time, some people who are going to die are faithful to God's law. And how do they understand that? So many disasters that befell them were the sign that God had not deserted them, but were purging some. And there will be some who, as we'll see in 2 seconds. Martyrdom was a significant theme. So Christianity will pick up on the theme of the 2nd Maccabees, that we will stand for our faith. So in those first centuries of Christianity, when persecution came, instead of people turned and said, no, really, I'm not a Christian, I'm not following the way, they would come to appreciate that the Maccabees stood up because their belief in the resurrection, knowing that God will be faithful. Eleazar and the mother of the 7 sons give these examples of faithfulness, giving one's life. And of course, Judas's final victory prevented, as I said at the very start, Sir Leslie raised it, the extermination of the Jewish religion. Why? Because truly, had the Maccabees not stood up and fought, the Jews would have been overcome by those who are inside saying, let's do all the other things and give up on our faith. Let us water down our faith. They pretty much would have had a watered down faith to literally nothing. And that is the intention of Antiochus, that he didn't want any other religious group standing against the Greek culture that he was pushing.
But Noel,
Yes, sir.
how they celebrate the victory by having this, what you call it, the Hanukkah? What
Hanukkah.
you call it?
Yes, it's Hanukkah.
Eh,
That is
eh,
correct.
but they not give
The
give
credit
them
to the Jews.
eh, eh,
So
to
that
the
is one of
Maccabees.
the major ironies. So everybody that's on this slide, we will see the 7 brothers. Don't want to go into detail because it is the Feast of Rededication, or Hanukkah. So it has both titles, and Chotka. This celebration that the Jews has even to today is celebrating this victory that the Maccabees brought about, bringing about victory and controlling, giving them, liberating them. emancipating them and liberating them. Yet still they celebrate the feast, but they do not have the books in their Bible. So, Sir Leslie, the
Yes,
short
sir.
answer to this question is, if you listen carefully, it's a little tricky, but if you listen carefully, the Hasmoneans is the Maccabees, and their descendants were the Sadducees. Opposing them during the time after Judas Maccabee in the fourth generation of the family, when they started to say corruption has taken over in the temple, the Pharisees developed and became a strong, dominant religious group even to the time of Jesus.
So politics then.
So it's a little more than politics, but it does have some element of it. And here is how the curve turns. It so happens after Jesus' death and resurrection, the zealots at Jesus' time again followed the example of Judas Maccabees, revolted against the Romans, and their mantra is, God is on our side, we will be victorious. Regrettably, it didn't work out that way for them as it worked out for the Maccabees. The Zealots were eliminated by the Roman army. They eliminated the Sadducees, and the religious group left standing was the Pharisees, who would go on to now give modern day form of what Judaism today.
So do we still have Sadducees?
No, they were eliminated.
Okay.
They were completely eliminated. Full stop.
Excuse me,
Yes, but
Noel, so are you saying that the Pharisees might have been the group that sided with the Romans?
no, the opposite. I'm saying the Sadducees sided with the Romans.
But they're all from the family of the what's it?
Hasmoneans.
Hasmoneans,
Yes,
aren't
but
they?
remember now, these guys been flip-flopping. They've been
Okay.
flip-flopping, which is what caused the problem in the first place. If they were all straight and all generations that followed straight, then the thing would have worked out possibly a little cleaner. But as you go through the books of Maccabees, in the third and the fourth generations, you start to realize there's infighting in the family. And what started out as a wonderful victory for great-grandfather, then by the time we reach fourth and fifth generation, human beings are being very human. They're taking bribes. As I said, one of them decided to be both king, tetrarch, as well as priest, high priest. And that was not allowed throughout the whole of Israel into Judaism. So the argument that is often raised that modern day Judaism is based off of rabbinic Pharisaic Judaism. They didn't like the Maccabees, and that's possibly one of the reasons why the books of the Maccabees were not included. That's just plain, plain, plain. And here's a reason further, Sir Leslie. In their retelling, so they actually do have in Rabbinic Judaism, Mishnah, they retell the event of the rededication of the temple. And in there, they do not highlight, as First and Second Maccabees does, the great military victory. What they highlight is what we see in the Feast of Lights, which is the miracle where a consecrated can of oil, which was intended to last for one night, lasts for the
10 years.
whole time. And hence that's why it's called the Feast of Lights. Principle, downplay the military side and highlight the spiritual side, which is what Rabbinic Judaism's intention was, not to. Now, can I give you the twist on human history? Under Netanyahu and over the last couple of decades, they have again highlighted the feast of Hanukkah, but highlighting the military side of it. So the Zionists will highlight the military aspect of Hanukkah.
So the Zionists are the zealots reincarnated.
That is absolutely 100% correct. And Netanyahu is in that category. Regrettably, that's the nature of it. So that's in a nutshell a contributing factor. Not the only single, because many of these things, it's not one single factor. But if you read carefully and hear the different religious groups and assimilate it, you will see how come and why some of these things eventually turned out. Now, interestingly enough, come in, Lincoln, interestingly enough, we hear about the Feast of Lights at the time of Jesus. They were celebrating the Feast of Lights. In John chapter 10, verse 22, we hear Jesus deciding to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Lights. So the event of Hanukkah and Feast of Lights were celebrated at the time of Jesus. And if you guys know the time frame we're talking about, this would have been within 100 years. So it's still, quote unquote, fresh history in the minds of the Judeans. It's something their generations would have been retelling as recent events. Even though they're retelling Passover, they're retelling all of King David, but this is fresh history. Yes, Uncle Lincoln.
Yeah, I know you always been speaking about Max your Romeo
That's
record.
next week.
Give me back Maccabees verse. How does the Rastafarian?
So that's next week's discussion, Lincoln. So hold that question for next week. So next week we'll pick up on that. So for
Then Lincoln
those,
play the record till next week.
yes. So those who joined in late, we've been looking. So I want to touch on the two things. The purification of the temple is described in two places. It's described in 1 Maccabees chapter 4, and it's also described in 2 Maccabees chapter 10, if I remember correctly. So the events are retold, but a different perspective, if I remember correctly, as how they want to retell it. And so in 2 Maccabees 10, purification of the temple, and of course, everybody, you'll see the spelling Maccabeus or Maccabee, the Greek, because it's Greek words. When Maccabeus and his companions, under the Lord's leadership, had recovered the temple, 2 Maccabees 10, everybody, and the city, they destroyed the altars erected by the Gentiles in the marketplace and sacrifice and sacred enclosures. After purifying the temple, they made a new altar. Then, with fire struck from flint, they offered sacrifice for the first time in 2 years, because they were banned from doing it, burned incense and lighted lamps. They also set out the showbread. When they had done this, they prostrated themselves and begged the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortune, and that if they should sin at any time, he might chastise them with moderation and not hand them over to blasphemous and barbarous Gentiles. On the anniversary of the day on which the temple had been profaned by the Gentiles, that is, the 25th of the same month of Chislev, the purification of the temple took place. The Jews celebrated joyfully for 8 days as on the Feast of Booths, remembering how a little while before they had spent the Feast of Booths living like wild animals in caves on the mountains. The Feast of Booths is celebrating the time that they were in the desert back in the Old Testament. But notice their interpretation, theological reflection on the events was to say, why did we come to this and have to go through all of this? And the answer is because we fell into sin. And they're saying, God, do clean us up early next time and don't allow us to get to so much sin that we have to go through this major punishment. They're saying, God, punish us when we start getting bad. Don't allow us to get to this extreme position where we now have to go through this purging process. So that's a theological reflection coming out into that prayer that they're saying, don't allow us to get to, that's verse 4. When they had done this, they prostrated themselves and begged the Lord that they might never again fall into such misfortunes, that if they should sin at any time, he might chastise them with moderation and not leave it to the point where he might have to hand them over to this kind of serious punishment. And of course, our Catholic perspective takes us to our sins, recognizing our sins, that we avoid the near occasions of sin and don't wait until we end up in the big moral decay, but we avoid sin from we start to recognize, hey, we're getting too close here. Same principle that they're saying here. And the point that I wanted to raise here, notice in here it doesn't describe the miracle that the Jews now celebrate. So we'll see the menorah, the large candlestick with 8 or 9 candles, 7, 8 or 9 candles on them. You'll see that, and they're talking about the fact that when Judas went in, he looked for oil for the celebration and only found one consecrated that is supposed to only last one night. That miracle is not described in the books of the Maccabees, but it is in the Mishnah, the oral traditions that the rabbinic Jews have put to and made connection. Before the time runs out, we won't go through all of it because it is painful to do this, but it is critically important for us to appreciate. And it's chapter 7 in verse 2. It also happened that 7 brothers with their mother were arrested and tortured with whips and scourges by the king, Epiphanes IV, to force them to eat pork in violation of God's law. Yes, Lincoln, I know you're hearing this and making connections with the Rastafarians. One of the brothers, speaking for the others, said, "What do you expect to achieve by questioning us? We are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors." Verse 3, at that, the king in a fury gave orders to have pans and cauldrons heated. While they were being quickly heated, he commanded his executioners to cut out the tongues of the one who had spoken for the others. This gets gory. To scalp him and cut off his hands and feet, while the rest of his brothers and his mother looked on. When he was completely maimed, but still breathing, the king ordered them to carry him to the fire and fry him. As a cloud of smoke spread from the pan, and the brothers and their mother encouraged one another, "Die bravely," saying such words as these: "The Lord God is looking on, and he truly has compassion on us, as Moses declared in his canticle, when he protested openly with the words, 'And he will have pity on his servant.' When the first brother had died in this manner, they brought the second to be made sport of. After tearing off his skin and hair, Will you eat the pork rather than have your body tortured limb by limb? Answering in the language of his foreparents, he said, Never. So he too in turn suffered. And this goes through for all 7 brothers. And then ultimately, all of them stand up for their faith. The mother too will also. And in a very, very passionate appeal she makes to her last son to say to him, they got to the point where they started to bribe him. And she says to him, she had scarcely, so we're skipping down to verse 27. In derision of the cruel tyranny, she leaned over close to her son and said in their native language, Son, have pity on me who carried you in my womb for 9 months, nursed you for 3 years, brought you up, educated and supported you to your present age. I beg you, child, to look at the heaven and the earth. So that's verse 28, and see all that is in them. Then you will know that God did not make them out of existing things. Put an asterisk there, and we'll come back to that in a few seconds. And in the same way, the human race came into existence. Do not be afraid of this executioner, but be worthy of your brothers and accept death, so that in the time of mercy I may receive you again with them. And she had scarcely finished speaking when the youth said, What are you waiting for? I will not obey the king's command. I will obey the command of the law given to our forefathers through Moses. But you who have contrived every kind of affliction for the Hebrews, and he goes back to the Hebrews, I suppose to explain that as well, will not escape the hands of God. We indeed are suffering because of our sins, not blaming others, our sins. Now, just a notation in that verse 28, this is one of the very few places where this insight, and it's a simple statement that you could easily overlook, but it's one of the few places in Scripture where the Jewish understanding of creation is reaffirmed. And what do we mean by that? It is Jewish Genesis, where God creates everything out of nothing. Sounds simple and we take it for granted, but not many other books in the Old Testament reaffirm this particular understanding, that God creates ex nihilo, everything out of nothing. Why is it significant? Because many of the other quote-unquote religious perspectives, whether it's Greek, whether it's Assyrian, it's the Amorites, God has to take some clay and do something to create the universe. God creates through the utterance. Yes, Lincoln? Right. So that's in Second Maccabees, the theme of martyrdom. The sections continue to tell of the successive descendants over the next 100 years and the challenges of remaining faithful while being influenced by the Greek culture. Now, what's the message for Christianity today? It should be abundantly clear. The Christian faith and those who follow the faith are called by God to be distinctive. Are called by God. And if ever we become so much so integrated in the other ways of life that don't see the same principles that God teaches us, then we could be assimilated and just become a part of the rest of the world. So Christianity is called to transform the world, to bring the world to these teachings of what referred to, the covenantal understanding. And the warning is for us that we too are in a world each day that we're being tempted to do the compromise and assimilate, not stand out, not say the principal thing. And our world is, of course, now in a very, very difficult period where this is going on and will continue to be and has been in this state for a long time. But a message from the Maccabees is Christianity ought to transform the culture and not allow the culture to cause us to assimilate to the point that we don't seem to be any different from any other way of life. Because Christianity is different. It's not one and the same. Yes, Lincoln.
Yeah. When I look at the Rastafarians, how they start to attach themselves to the Maccabees, and how I get the impression that they sided with them or love that kind of faith. But when we look at how they look at Selassie as the king, how you time that with what the modern Rastas, how they look at things now?
So you will remember, and you'll know I'll always say that there are, so everybody, the questions that Uncle Lincoln is bringing up are all of the questions that are going to be addressed in next week's session. So tonight's session brings us around to looking at all of the 7 books and having an appreciation of the theological value they bring for us in Christianity. And there's lots more. I've just, as you would expect, pulled out 2 or 3 themes for us and the value that they bring to us. Also, please remember, the 7 books are included in our liturgical cycle, meaning our daily readings are daily readings where we take 1 whole week from the book of Sirach. We also take readings this Sunday. We took readings from the book of Wisdom as well. There's a whole week we took a couple of readings from the book of Maccabees. So these readings are also integrated into our liturgical cycle. So they're not simply put out there as separate. We integrate them into all our liturgical cycle. So a part of why I also do 1st and 2nd Maccabees here in preparation for next week's session is to demonstrate the point that there's absolutely nothing to be fearful in the book of Maccabees in the Jamaican cultural context. There seems to be something going on there. So, Lincoln, so next week, I give you strong advice. You are invited to come and join us. Is not a Bible study. So this week, there's 3 weeks, and I'll post out the video. It will be on Catholic Canon, a website that I've created that has now at least 12 of our Bible study sessions. So I'll send out the link and everybody can access the videos for this last 3 series, as well as the series of Bible studies that we've been doing since May, which included Pentecost, the teachings on Pentecost, the teachings on Corpus Christi, the teachings on the Trinity. So we have a series of weekly videos that are posted to that website where we can, anybody who's interested to look back on any of those teachings are available. Next week, we're going to be looking on what Uncle Lincoln spoke about, the Maccabees Bible. This is a socio-cultural investigation in the Jamaican culture. What is it that we refer to as a Maccabee Bible, as Uncle Lincoln mentioned? How is it connected to a Bible? And you will see I have done these talks, so there are a couple of them already on YouTube, and each of the presentations can have, and this goes back to a question that was asked at the very start, what is being referred to as a Maccabees Bible? So one answer is tonight's discussion. The Catholic Bible is and can be understood to be the Maccabee Bible because it is a book Bible with 73 books, including 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Now, if you take that line of argument, you could also give the answer that the original King James, which contain these books of the Maccabees, could also be the Maccabee Bible. So I've done both presentations, the Catholic Bible being the Maccabee Bible, the original King James being the Maccabee Bible. Next week, we'll be looking on the third possible perspective, and that possible perspective is looking at one view of what else the Maccabee Bible could be. And this is an area of my research, so it is, may I remind you, not a biblical study. So those of you who are very keen on going through scriptures as we did tonight, it's not going to be that approach. It's going to be looking at the social, cultural issue, the different people who have given their voices and views on what is the Maccabee Bible. And it is a perspective, and there, I trust there's multiple perspectives. So Uncle Lincoln, I know you'll be here. For those who may be looking for Bible study, just to give you the heads up from now, it's going to be more a research in the cultural theme of Max Romeo's song, Bring Back the Maccabee Version. What is he talking about, and how do we understand that in the Jamaican context? As well as why, which was a big question I was attempting to answer, why does it seem like there is some people who exhibit a fear when they hear about the Maccabee Bible and people are being told, don't read it, because if you read it, it will fly up in your head. Why is that so? If it's what we just discussed a while ago, which is the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, then there's nothing in there that anybody should be fearful of, as we looked on a while ago. So what is that? And that's what the investigation is. So looking forward to persons, again, if you know anybody who has a particular interest in that area, we look on it. We are in the planning stage. Uncle Ray usually says, take a break in August. We are in the planning stage that we have not yet done presentations on the year of St. Francis. So we are in the mode of getting some presenters and doing at least 2 sessions in August on the year of St. Francis and its interpretation and significance for our faith. So we will not have a Bible study on the public holiday, then maybe 2 sessions on St. Francis, and maybe take a little break, and then we'll return in September. So in the meanwhile, we'll have all the videos that we have available posted on the channel for people to sink their teeth into it. Thank you all for being a part. Any final question related to the Maccabees? So welcome back to those names that I haven't seen for a little while. I hope this was helpful. Yes, I'm going to let you go now. Deacon Glenn, thank you all for being here. And Deacon Glenn,
rating.
please.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
And may Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.
Go in peace to love and serve the Lord always.
Thanks be to God.
Be to God.
So the video recording will be sent out and made available for everybody.